The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Jim Rickards, the American lawyer and investment banker turned economist, thought leader, and author. You have over 35 years of experience working in the capital markets on Wall Street while also acting as an advisor to the CIA and the Pentagon. You topped the New York Times bestseller list with titles including The Death of Money, Currency Wars, and your most recent book, Sold Out, which explained how the broken supply chain and surging inflation will have catastrophic consequences on the global economy. You are known as the man who predicted the biggest financial crisis in American history, and right now, you believe we are facing an economic collapse far worse than that of 2008. One that will lead to a major upheaval of the international monetary system and the dollar losing its status as the global reserve currency. Jim, welcome back to London Real.
Thank you, Brian. Great to be with you.
Always great to have you back. Before we get started, I just want to alert everyone to an important video that you've just recorded that will not be available to the public. Here, you discuss the upcoming geopolitical shockwave of what you call the most significant development in international finance since 1971. But then you explain how anyone can position themselves to profit from this crisis. Our viewers can access that video at londonreal.tv/Jim, and I highly recommend that everyone go watch that immediately after our conversation. Jim, let's get into it. I'm increasingly concerned about a recession in the US and here in the UK, with our house prices falling for the first time in 11 years, and people are now predicting it to go down a shocking 10% in housing prices. Jim, are we already in a global recession?
That's a great question, Brian. The answer is probably yes. We never know for sure until after the fact, because you're in it, you got to wait for the data. Then in the United States, I mean, they're not the global arbiter, but in the United States, we have something called the National Bureau of Economic Research. It's based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's not a government agency. It's a private group of like 12 prominent economists, egghead types. And they're the ones who declare when the recession began and when it ended. But they're usually, it's like a year after the fact. It's like, maybe in the middle of next year, they'll say, recession started in the first quarter of 2023. We're like, thank you, we knew that. But it's usually over before they declare it. So I'm not waiting for the official arbiter. I look at a lot of other indicators, and they're almost uniformly bad. And they have very good track records of getting the predictions right, not unlike the Fed, which is always wrong, always late. So without getting too technical, the Fed's looking at unemployment. And it's based on the so-called Phillips curve. It says, unemployment's down, inflation's up. If unemployment's up, inflation's down. That's the Phillips curve. You can draw it, and the Fed's using that to guide policy. The Phillips curve is garbage, and it's not a personal insult against Professor Phillips. It's the case that there's no empirical support for it. I could give you examples going back to the 1930s of low unemployment, low inflation, which we had in the early 60s. 1930s, we had high unemployment, low inflation, even deflation. Late 1970s, what did we have? High unemployment and high inflation. That was called stagflation. So I can give you examples. If you think of it as a quad chart, unemployment, inflation, fill in the blanks. I could give you all four examples: low, 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 high, high, low, high, high, which means there's no correlation. If you can have any one of them, there's no correlation. So the Phillips curve has no predictive value on its face because the data doesn't back it up. Last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was a flat line. At least where I went to school, curves were not flat, but there it is. Now, it's worse than that because unemployment, even if you thought it was a good indicator of something, particularly inflation, It's a lagging indicator, or a lagging indicator of recession, as the case may be. So let's say you're an employer, a business person. I mean, you're an entrepreneur. I start businesses. When you're in a tough spot, when revenues are down and things are slowing down, margins are getting compressed and all that, the last thing you want to do is fire people, because it took a while to find them, hire them, train them. You don't want to let them go. You do everything else. Like you turn down the lights, you call your landlord, negotiate a cheaper rent, slow pay your creditors, drive a hard bargain on something. You do everything else to maintain your margins. And then only when all else fails do you start firing people. But so first of all, it's a lagging indicator. You're already in the recession before you get around to firing people, number one. Number two, because you held on so long, you tend to do it en masse. It's not like, well, I'm going to fire one person a month for the next year. It's like, I'm going to hang on to all of them and then maybe, sadly, fire them all at once because I have no other choice. So A, it's a lagging indicator. B, it can turn on a dime from very low unemployment to very high unemployment within a matter of months. And if that's what the Fed's relying on, which they are, they say so. It's not a guess. They say that's what we're watching. Two things. Number one, you're not going to see the recession coming. It's a lagging indicator, and it can go from kind of good to bad almost overnight. So the Fed's, driving this way, looking out the back window, and they're probably going to wreck the economy. But there are a lot of other signs to say, okay, Jim, unemployment's not a good measure, and it isn't. But how do you know what are the good metrics? They tend to be a little technical. They tend to be things that very few people look at, but they're there. They're not secret. The big one, I think this gets more notice, is an inverted Treasury yield curve. Oh, well, what does that mean? So a normal yield curve, it's like the longer the maturity, the higher the rate. That's common sense. So if I'm going to lend somebody money for a month, I might charge a certain interest rate. But if I'm going to lend you money for 10 years, I want a much higher interest rate because there's a lot more risk, inflation, default, credit risk, who knows what. So a normal yield curve is upward sloping. The longer the maturity, the higher the rate. Okay, right now, yield curves are inverted, which means they're downward sloping, which means the longer the maturity, the lower the rate. Why would you take a lower rate on a 10-year Treasury note than you would on an overnight loan, that's where we are today, by the way. The overnight rate is over 5, and the 10-year rate's 3.6, give or take. Well, why would you take a lower rate for a longer term loan? It makes no sense. Well, it makes no sense unless you think the bottom is falling out of the economy. Because if I buy a 10-year note with a 3.7% yield to maturity, which I could do today, that seems low compared to the 5% for the overnight rate, but that might look really good a year from now. If interest rates are 1%, if the 10-year note is 1%, that 3.7% rate is going to look really sweet. It's like, hey, I got to get a very high return. So in other words, this is the big money. This is the institutional money. This is people who know more than central bankers in many cases, betting that interest rates are going to come down a lot. Because if they weren't, that inverted yield curve would make no sense. And so they're betting that the economy is going into a severe recession. Interest rates are going to drop, and those 3.7% yields are going to look really good. Now, just to get a little more arcane, there's something called the SOFR futures curve. SOFR is the new LIBOR. There were problems with LIBOR, but these are long-term bets on overnight rates. Treasury is a snapshot of what I think the 10-year rate is going to be, but the SOFR is the opposite. They trade in strips, quarterly settlements that go out 3 or 4 years, 5 years, but the longer ones aren't that liquid. But basically, I can make a bet as to what I think the overnight rate is going to be 1 year from today. That yield curve is also steeply inverted. And again, this is the real who trades SOFR futures. Well, the institutions and central banks and the big money, in other words. And it's in the data. It's not a guess. You can look at it. It's publicly available, and it says rates are going to drop steeply in the months and year ahead. So again, these are, when you have an inverted SOFR yield curve, an inverted Treasury yield curve, it's basically the big money betting that rates are going to drop like a stone. Well, why would that be? Well, there are only two reasons. One, a severe recession and a steep drop in inflation. And those two things do go together. One more example, again, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but there's something, the Fed has an overnight reverse repo facility. And what does that mean? So the Fed says, hey, send me some give me your cash, and I'll give you a treasury bill as collateral, and then we'll unwind it at some point in the future. It's called a reverse repo. So I can call up the Fed, have them send me treasury bills as collateral, give them cash, and they'll pay me interest on that. It's a phone call. I don't have to do anything fancy. Okay. But the Treasury also sells treasury bills at auction, and I can bid on them, and people do. And the yield to maturity on those is lower than the Fed will give you for a phone call. So why would you bid an auction, take the market risk and get a yield that's lower than the one you can get for a phone call? Well, the answer is that the treasury bill that they send me when I do the treasury facility, I cannot rehypothecate it, meaning I have to hold it, give it back to the Fed when they want it, but I can't give it to you or anybody else. Whereas if I bid at auction, I can take that bill, I can pledge it to UBS, UBS can pledge it to Deutsche Bank can pledge it to Barclays, and they do. So, but the reason I bid more aggressively for that and take a lower yield, I'm fighting for a lower yield instead of the higher yield I can get for free, is because I need the collateral. That's a sign that there's a collateral shortage, that banks are reducing their balance sheets, they're unwinding derivatives, et cetera. So sorry to be a little technical, Brian, but the point is when you look at two inverted yield curves and an auction rate that's lower than what you can get for a phone call, they all say the same thing. Rates are going down, the economy is going to crash, and there's a collateral scarcity, and banks are tightening up their balance sheets. So they're all bad signs.
Yeah, when I got to Bankers Trust in 1993, I got thrown right on the swap book, and I soon learned about the mercantile exchange with the LIBOR futures, and we would trade them all the way out to what we called the reds and the blacks. So that was 9 years, 10 years out of these forward 3-month rates. So it's actually right there to see. You don't need to do bond math, subtract the 10-year rate from the 7-year rate to see those forward yields. It's actually right there in black and white where you can see the forward 3-month rates, and it kind of spells out what the market is telling you those forward rates are going to be. And it's right there. And like you said, that's the institutional money betting, and that money is usually righter than the Fed, right?
Correct. And by the way, you mentioned swaps and derivatives. It reminds me of another indicator. Just quickly, swap rates are we have negative swap rates. What does that mean? Well, what is a swap? So I buy a 10-year Treasury note and I finance it in the overnight market. So what's happening to me? I'm getting the yield on the 10-year Treasury note, and I'm paying an overnight yield. So I'm receiving fixed, paying floating. Well, sometime in the 80s, but certainly, in your experience in the 90s, in my experience, at some point somebody said, hey, why don't we get rid of the bond? Like, just pay fixed and receive floating. Who needs the bond? The bond's a piece of collateral, but we can have a contract. So that's a swap, a simple form of swap. So I do a swap with Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank says, okay, Jim, I'll pay you the 10-year rate. You pay me the overnight rate. It's exactly the same as if you had the note and we're financing it in the repo market. It's just receive fixed, pay floating. And that's a swap. Pardon me. But if you think of the credit risk, at least with the 10-year Treasury note, I got the United States government behind me. If I'm doing a swap with, UBS, I got bank risk. I've got some credit risk in the bank. Credit Suisse just failed. So it's logical. It makes sense that the rate I get from UBS should be slightly higher than the Treasury rate. The swap rate from a bank should be slightly higher than the comparable maturity of a government security, because the government security is slightly safer than a big bank. Well, right now, that's not true. UBS, or, I'm picking on UBS, Barclays, anybody else in a swap, the rate I get is lower than I get from a 10-year Treasury note. So why would I do that? Why would I take the poorer credit and take a lower rate instead of a higher rate? Well, the answer is the swap is off balance sheet, and the Treasury note, if I own it, I got to put it on my balance sheet. So when you see negative swap rates, meaning the riskier credit is paying you less than the government credit, what it means is that the balance sheets are constrained. I got to do the off balance sheet trade because we can't use up the balance sheets. That's consistent with what we just talked about with the inverted yield curves, which is there's a major credit contraction. There's a collateral shortage, a dollar shortage, and a credit contraction. If that's not a recipe for a recession, I don't know what it is.
Wow, this is powerful stuff. And what I love it, Jim, is when you and I start talking like this, a lot of the audience, they understand more than I always think they will. They kind of get it. So many people now are way up the curve on this stuff. And again, these things are right there if you know what to look for. You've also just recorded this video that will not be available to the public. You're going to talk about this upcoming geopolitical shockwave of what you call the most significant development in international finance since 1971. But then you also explain how anyone can position themselves to profit on this crisis. People can access that at londonreal.tv/Jim. Again, highly recommend people check that out when we're done. What's next, Jim? You've pointed the finger, I think, at the Biden administration for a lot of this recession. You have said that the president has dropped down drained our oil reserves more than any president in history. Obviously, this is ongoing war in Ukraine. How much of this is the president's fault? How much of it is its supply chain? And where are we currently at now? What are we, about 17 months before an election?
Right. It's a great list, Brian, because you can say, well, we could talk about the war in Ukraine. Yeah, we could talk about monetary policy. We just kind of did, go through some of the recession indicators. We can talk about the election, but they're all connected. I mean, that's really where the complexity theory and the density of the network comes in, because these things are all connected. So just to spend a minute on Ukraine. By the way, I just last week conducted I do this annually, so it's been 8 years in a row, conducted a seminar on financial warfare at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it is at the Army War College, but there are people there from all branches. It's a very elite group, handpicked, about 12 students, mid-career officers, so they're kind of late 30s, early 40s, lieutenant colonels, and from all branches. So I get Marines, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and a few civilians, State Department, and CIA, NSA, intelligence community. But it's a fun group, 12, 13. I look at the resumes, amazingly accomplished. They all have multiple master's degrees, the occasional PhD, speak 4 languages, been deployed from Iraq to, Colombia or wherever. But they've been handpicked as the future big brains. These are people 5 years from now, they'll be 3-star generals on the National Security Council, et cetera. So it's a fun class. And my topic is financial warfare, which is kind of like finance and warfare, which is what we're mashing up right now. But and I spent a lot of time talking about this whole BRICS thing, and we can talk about that if you like. But I tell, in interviews like this, Brian, I always explain, I said, I didn't say anything in the U.S. Army War College that I'm not saying in this interview. It's not like I have a secret package for them and we do something else. So I just say the same thing. You can take it or leave it. You can agree or disagree. But it's a great group, very interactive. But I was talking about the Ukraine war, and I said, one of the most difficult things about this is getting reliable information. I said, in a war, everybody lies, so the U.S. lies. If you ask me what has surprised me about the war, the conduct of the war, the development hasn't really been a surprise. Russia was always going to win, just a question of how long, and it's tragic. But I'm surprised at how many warmongers there are in the UK. I'm not, France is they're mushy. Germany's between a rock and a hard place. Hungary is actually against the war. Italy, again, a little mushy. But and the U.S. has the warmongers. I know that. But starting with Boris Johnson and going to Rishi Sunak, I mean, they're more bloodthirsty than the Americans, and they're the ones providing the Challenger tanks, et cetera. I don't quite get it. I think all these Chamberlain, Churchill, Hitler metaphors fall down. I mean, I know history. I know what Chamberlain did, and I know, Winston Churchill was one of the great heroes of the 20th century. But I don't see that parallel. I don't see.
Are they doing it to try to get a better trade deal with the U.S.? Is it that simple, or no?
Well, it disappoints me to see the U.K. act as kind of lackeys of the U.S. I mean, it's sad to see. I mean, it's not the heyday of the British Empire, but it's one of the largest economies in the world, major financial center, nuclear power. I mean, it's not like it's a tertiary power, but I see what's going on, but I have to say, I don't understand it. I don't see why the UK can't go their own way a little bit, but they are, so they're not. But not to get too immersed in the positive, you can pretty much lay the entire Ukrainian tragedy at Biden's feet, because Russia would not have invaded Ukraine in February of 2022 if they hadn't been provoked for 14 years. I mean, going back to 2008. So what happened in 2008? George W. Bush stands up at a NATO summit and says, Georgia and Ukraine should join NATO. He just said that. Three months later, Putin invades Georgia.
Yeah, during the Olympics, right? During the Olympics, I think, right?
Yeah, well, that's right, 2008 Olympics. So Bush says Georgia and Ukraine should join NATO. Putin almost immediately invades Georgia and takes the place over. It's like, were you not paying attention? Did you not get the message? And we had the global financial crisis and a lot else. So fast forward to 2014, what happens? They have an election in Ukraine. A pro-Russia, pro-Putin president wins. You can debate, election, how high quality was the election. You can say, I don't like the guy, but he won. There actually was an election. And within months, the MI6 and CIA, working with neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine, and they've been there since the Second World War, overthrow the guy. They basically, they had the Maidan Square color revolution, so-called, which is all orchestrated by the intelligence agencies. They got snipers, they're killing people. The Ukrainian, the anti-Russian Ukrainians were doing the killing. And then the guy flees for his life, goes to Russia, and the U.S. installs a puppet.
Wasn't Soros funding Vice to go there and cover it in the central square? And
correct, yeah.
Right.
Victoria Nuland's behind the whole thing. She's like got blood, coming out of her mouth. I don't know, so Putin's like, wait a second, we had an election, the pro-Russian guy wins, and you stage a coup, de facto coup, and kick him out and put in a puppet. So what does Putin do next? He invades Crimea, or annexes Crimea, takes it over. So it's like, okay, Georgia should join NATO. He invades Georgia. Ukraine should join NATO. We just had a coup. He takes over Ukraine. Are you not paying attention? Are you, meaning the West, US, UK, are you not paying attention to what's going on here? And then they sponsored, anyway, without getting, they sponsored attacks on the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine, etc. So by 2022, Putin's at the end of his rope. Now, yes, he did invade. Of course he did, and no, there's no disputing that. But it was the Minsk Accords, which were balanced, I would say. They gave Donbass some autonomy in exchange for neutrality, and Ukraine would not join NATO, etc. But Angela Merkel was later quoted as saying that was always a joke. We never intended to honor them. And Putin's feeling like a sucker at this point, which he kind of was. So, in other words, how many times can you poke the tiger in the eye before the tiger strikes? And that's the question. So, yeah, Russia invaded, I get it, but it was 14 years of provocation, and now they're playing for keeps. But the U.S. wanted this war because they were, and they are, delusional. They're like, yeah, bring it on, because Russia will be depleted. They'll get killed. They'll use up their armaments. They'll deplete their arsenals, their inventories. They'll spend a lot of money. We'll throw sanctions on them like crazy. They'll go broke. The Russians, there'll be unrest in Russia. We'll get rid of Moscow, we'll get rid of Putin, and we'll go all the way to Moscow and put Russia back where they were in the 90s with Boris Yeltsin and a bottle of vodka before breakfast. None of that has played out. Everything I just said, that was the goal. And they say so. Again, I'm not breaking into safes in Washington. They say these things. But every one of them has turned out to be the opposite. Here's what's actually happening. Number one, World Bank, not exactly a Russian puppet. They're pretty much controlled by the U.S., projects Russian growth this year at 0.7%, but it's been revised upward. Now go back to early 2022. What were they saying? Russian economy is going to collapse. It's the end of the ruble. Biden is like, we're going to bury the ruble.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.